Tonight, on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to 1885 London, the world's largest city, where gaslight flickered against wet cobblestones and 2 million souls pressed together in fog so thick you could taste the coal in it. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other. And tonight, we say their names out loud because they could not. I am Julian. This is Gay Timeline. In the autumn of 1885, on a drizzly Thursday evening, a man named Edward Carpenter walked into the lobby of the Old Plough Hotel on Oxford Street with another man beside him. They carried no luggage. The desk clerk looked up from his ledger, took in the two men standing perhaps an inch closer than friends might stand, and without a word turned the registry book toward them. Edward signed his own name. The other man signed nothing. The clerk handed them a key to room 14. 3 shillings and 6pence for the night. No questions asked. Edward Carpenter would later write about that exact moment in his private journals, which survived in the Manchester archives. He described the strange weight of walking through that lobby, the way his companion's hand brushed against his own in the stairwell, the sense that they had passed through some invisible membrane between the public world and a private one. The moment the door closed behind them, he wrote, he could finally breathe. To understand why that moment mattered, and why a hotel room could feel like sanctuary, you have to understand something Victorian London believed about men like Edward that most history books refuse to explain. But first, a few quick things before we settle in. If you find yourself drawn into this story, the like and subscribe buttons are there for you, but only if this is genuinely your kind of evening. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, let us go back to London. For most of history, men like Edward Carpenter were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be, a quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. By the end of tonight, you will know which hotels would take 2 men without luggage, which desk clerks knew the code, and what happened when someone got the signals wrong. You will know the real names of the men who mapped this hidden city, the private language they used to find each other, and what it cost them when the map failed. The city you are entering is the largest in the world, and inside it is another city entirely. Invisible unless you know how to look. Let us see if you can find it. Good luck. If you were a gay man in Victorian London, the first thing you learned was how to read a room, not the decor, not the furniture, the people. You learned to scan a hotel lobby in the 3 seconds it took to walk from the street door to the front desk, cataloguing every face, every glance, every small shift in posture that might tell you whether this place was safe or whether you should turn around and walk back out into the rain. You learned this skill the way you learned to walk. Gradually, through trial and error, through watching other men make mistakes you would not repeat. No one sat you down and taught you. There was no guidebook. There was only observation, inference, and the quiet understanding that a single error could ruin your life. The year is 1885. You are standing outside the Adelphi Hotel on the Strand, one of the most respectable establishments in central London. Inside, gaslights gleam against polished wood. A doorman in green livery stands beneath the awning. Through the glass doors you can see the front desk, the Persian rug, the potted ferns, the leather chairs arranged in careful symmetry. You are here with a man you have known for 6 months. You met at a private party in Fitzroy Square. You have spent stolen hours together in parks, in museums, walking along the embankment pretending to admire the river. Tonight, for the first time, you are attempting something far more dangerous. You are attempting to rent a room. Your companion is standing beside you on the pavement, close enough to suggest intimacy, not so close that a passing stranger would notice. The rain is picking up. You can feel the dampness creeping through your wool coat, smell the coal smoke mixing with the river damp and the faint sour tang of horse manure from the street. Your heart is pounding so hard you are certain he can hear it. The doorman is watching. You make a choice. You walk in. The Adelphi Hotel, it turns out, was not one of the safe ones. The desk clerk took one look at the two of you. No luggage, no wives, no plausible reason for two young men to need a room together at 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening, and his face went carefully blank. He informed you, in a voice loud enough to carry across the lobby, that all rooms were fully booked for the evening. He was very sorry. Perhaps you might try the Savoy. You knew he was lying. You had seen the rack of keys behind him, rows of them, most still hanging on their hooks. But you also knew there was no point in arguing. You thanked him. You walked back out into the rain. Your companion said nothing. You walked 3 blocks in silence before either of you spoke. This happened to real men, over and over. The historical record is full of their failed attempts. In 1889, a clerk named George Ives tried to book a room at the Russell Hotel in Bloomsbury with a young man he had met at a socialist meeting. The desk clerk asked if they were brothers. George said no. The clerk asked if they were business associates requiring separate rooms. George hesitated a fraction too long. The clerk informed him the hotel had a strict policy against, and here he paused, as if choosing his words carefully. Unaccompanied gentlemen sharing accommodation. George Ives wrote about that moment in his diary, which is now held in the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas. He described the walk back out to the street, the rain soaking through his hat, the overwhelming sense of having failed some test he had not known he was taking. They spent that night apart, in separate rented rooms 3 streets away from each other, because finding 2 rooms was easy. Finding 1 room for 2 men was the trick. So you learned. You learned which hotels would take you and which would not. And you learned by accumulating failure until the pattern emerged. The Old Plough on Oxford Street would take you. The Sussex on Jermyn Street would take you. The boarding houses near Fitzroy Square, the cheaper hotels in Soho, the lodging houses in Whitechapel, where no one asked questions because questions were bad for business. But the Adelphi would not. The Langham would not. The grand hotels along Piccadilly, the respectable establishments near the parks, the family-run inns in Kensington, all of them had policies, unwritten but universally understood, about the kind of guests they preferred. And you learned to tell the difference before you walked in. You learned to read the architecture of discretion. The best hotels for men like you were never the grandest. They were the ones just slightly down the social ladder, prosperous enough to be clean and safe, not so respectable that they could afford to be choosy. The ones where the desk clerk had seen enough of the world to know that morality was expensive and business was business. You learned to look for certain signs. A location near the theatre district, where it was plausible for 2 men to arrive late and leave early. A front desk positioned so the clerk could see you coming, but so the lobby was not visible from the street. A ledger that the clerk turned toward you without asking for identification, because asking for identification meant recording information, and recorded information could be subpoenaed. You learned that the clerks who would take you often had a certain look, tired, middle-aged, men who had worked the night desk long enough to develop a philosophical attitude toward human behaviour. Men who understood that 3 shillings and 6pence was 3 shillings and 6pence, and the Bank of England did not inquire about the moral status of the men whose coins it accepted. But you also learned that even at the safe hotels, there was a script you had to follow. You never walked in together. One of you went in first, signed the registry, paid for the room, took the key. The other waited outside, or across the street, or in a nearby pub, for 10 or 15 minutes. Then the second man walked in alone, climbed the stairs as if he belonged there, and knocked softly on the door of room 14 or room 9, or whichever number you had agreed upon beforehand. If anyone asked, you were visiting a friend who was staying at the hotel. If anyone pressed, you were discussing business. Late-night business. Confidential business. The kind that required privacy. The script was thin. Everyone knew it was thin, but it was plausible enough to give the desk clerk deniability, and deniability was all anyone wanted. The clerk did not want to know what you were doing in room 14. You did not want him to know. The script allowed both of you to pretend that nothing worth mentioning was happening, and that pretense was the grease that kept the whole system running. Edward Carpenter understood this better than most. By 1885, he had been navigating this hidden infrastructure for nearly a decade. He knew the safe hotels by heart. He knew which clerks could be trusted and which could not. He knew that the Old Plough on Oxford Street had a clerk named Thomas who worked the evening desk on Thursdays and Fridays and who had a certain look in his eye that meant he understood, and that understanding would cost you an extra shilling, slipped across the desk when you signed the registry. Edward was unusual in that he wrote it all down. Most men did not. Most men carried the knowledge silently, shared it only with other men who needed it, and took it to their graves. But Edward believed in documentation. He believed the future would want to know, so he kept journals, meticulous and careful, coded but not entirely opaque, and those journals survived. In October of 1885, Edward wrote about bringing a young man named Albert Fearnhoe to the Old Plough. Albert was a working-class man from Sheffield, a metalworker with rough hands and an accent that marked him as someone who did not belong in the polished neighbourhoods where Edward usually moved. They had met at a socialist lecture in Hammersmith. They had spent 3 months meeting in parks, taking long walks along the canal paths north of the city, sitting on benches in Kew Gardens pretending to admire the glasshouses. By October, Edward wanted more than benches. He wanted a room with a door that locked. He wanted an entire night, not stolen hours. He wanted to fall asleep beside someone and wake up beside them in the morning. So he took Albert to the Old Plough. Edward went in first, signed the registry with his own name, his real name, because he had decided years earlier that he would not live entirely in the shadows. Paid 4 shillings for the night, took the key to room 9, walked upstairs. 15 minutes later, Albert knocked on the door. Edward described that night in his journal in language that is restrained but unmistakable. He wrote about the texture of the sheets, rough cotton that smelled faintly of lye soap. He wrote about the rain against the window, the gaslight from the street below casting moving shadows on the ceiling. He wrote about the way Albert's hands, calloused from years of factory work, felt against his skin. He wrote about falling asleep with Albert's head on his chest and waking in the grey early morning light to find Albert still there, still sleeping, still real. He wrote, "I have spent years reading philosophy about love, and none of it prepared me for the simple fact of his weight beside me in a rented bed." That entry is dated October 12th, 1885. The journal is in the Manchester Archives, Box 14, Folder 3. You can request it. You can read it yourself. Edward wanted you to. But for every night like that one, there were a dozen failures. A dozen hotels that turned men away. A dozen desk clerks who saw something they did not like and suddenly discovered that all the rooms were booked. A dozen moments of standing in a lobby, heart pounding, waiting to see if you would be allowed to stay or told to leave. And the fear was not abstract. The fear had teeth. Because in 1885, what you were trying to do in that hotel room was illegal. Specifically, it was a crime under the Criminal Law Amendment Act, which had been passed just 3 months earlier, in August of 1885. Section 11 of that Act, which became known as the Labouchere Amendment after the Member of Parliament who proposed it, made gross indecency between men a criminal offence punishable by up to 2 years of hard labour. Gross indecency. The law never defined it. Any sexual contact between men, any intimacy, any touch that could be construed as more than friendship. The vagueness was intentional. It meant that almost anything could be prosecuted, and almost anyone could be arrested, and the police had nearly unlimited discretion about whom to pursue. Hotel rooms became crime scenes. Desk clerks became potential witnesses. The bed you shared with someone you loved became evidence. And the law was enforced, not universally, not consistently, but often enough that the threat was real. In the first year after the Labouchere Amendment passed, more than 40 men were prosecuted under Section 11 in London alone. Some of them were caught in parks, in public toilets, in alleyways, but some of them were caught in hotels. In January of 1886, just 4 months after the law passed, 2 men were arrested at a lodging house in Whitechapel. The landlady had heard sounds from their room, sounds she described to the police as inconsistent with innocent friendship. She had unlocked the door with her master key. She had found them in bed together. She had called the police. Both men were sentenced to 18 months of hard labour. Their names were John Parker and William Matthews. The trial records are in the Old Bailey archives, case number T-8860125187. The prosecuting attorney described their crime as an offence against nature and public decency. The judge said their behaviour was a stain upon the moral fabric of the city. The jury convicted them in less than 20 minutes. John Parker was 23 years old. William Matthews was 27. After they were released from prison, neither of them appeared in the public record again. They vanished. That is what the law did. It erased people. So when you walked into a hotel lobby in 1885 with another man and no luggage, you were not just risking embarrassment. You were risking arrest, prosecution, imprisonment, and social death. You were risking everything. And still, men kept trying. Because the alternative was worse. The alternative was living your entire life without ever spending a full night beside someone you loved. The alternative was stolen hours in parks and furtive meetings in public places, and the constant ache of wanting something you could never safely have. So you learned the map. You learned which hotels were safe and which were not. You learned the signals, the scripts, the small performances of plausibility that might protect you. You learned to read a desk clerk's face in 3 seconds and make a decision that could determine whether you spent the night in a rented bed or a police cell. And you learned that the map was always shifting. A hotel that was safe last month might not be safe this month because the management had changed, or the desk clerk had been replaced, or someone had complained to the local constable. You learned to share information carefully, quietly, only with men you trusted. You learned that the map existed only in memory, in whispered conversations, in the collective knowledge of men who had survived this long enough to know the terrain. There was a man named John Addington Symonds who tried to systematize it. Symonds was a historian, a scholar of Renaissance Italy, and a man who spent decades trying to understand and document what he called the intermediate sex. In the 1880s, he began compiling what he called a private geography of London, a list of places where men like him might find safety, companionship, and privacy. Hotels were part of that geography. Symonds never published the list. He was too afraid. But he shared it with friends, carefully, in private letters that he sometimes wrote in code. Some of those letters survived. One of them, dated March 1887, is held in the Bristol University Library. In it, Symonds wrote to a friend named Horatio Brown about a hotel near Covent Garden that he described as reliably discreet. He did not name the hotel directly. He referred to it as the place near the theatre where we once stayed, and the friend would have known which place he meant. That is how the knowledge travelled, obliquely, in coded references, in conversations that left no trace. The map existed, but it was invisible. And it had to stay invisible, because making it visible would destroy it. You learned to be part of that invisible network. You learned which friends could be trusted with the knowledge, and which could not. You learned that some men, even men who shared your desires, were too afraid to take the risk, and you did not push them. You learned that discretion was a form of kindness, that silence could be protective, that the men who survived longest were the ones who understood when to speak and when to stay quiet. But you also learned that silence had a cost, because every time you walked into a hotel lobby and pretended to be something you were not, every time you signed a false name in a registry or told a desk clerk a lie about why you needed a room, you gave up a small piece of yourself. You learned to live fractured, one self in public, another in private, and the line between those selves became so practiced, so automatic, that sometimes you forgot which one was real. Edward Carpenter wrote about that fracture in an essay published years later, in 1908. long after the most dangerous years had passed. He wrote, "We became actors in a play we did not write, performing roles we did not choose, for an audience that would have destroyed us if we ever stepped out of character. And the tragedy was not that we had to perform. The tragedy was that we became so good at it." The essay was called The Intermediate Sex, and it was one of the first public defences of homosexual love published in England. It nearly destroyed his reputation. But by 1908, Edward had decided that silence was more dangerous than honesty. He had decided that the men who came after him deserved a map that was not invisible. But in 1885, in that hotel room at the Old Plough, Edward was still performing, still careful, still aware that one mistake, one careless word, one desk clerk who decided to call the police instead of pocketing the extra shilling could end everything. The morning after that night with Albert Fernhoe, Edward woke early. The room was cold. The gaslight from the street had faded, and the grey London dawn was seeping through the thin curtains. Albert was still asleep beside him, breathing slowly, one arm thrown across Edward's chest. Edward lay still for a long time, listening to the sounds of the city waking up outside. The clatter of a cart on the cobblestones. The distant shout of a street vendor. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled damp, that particular London smell of wet stone and coal smoke and river water. He thought about the door, the lock, the thin barrier between this room and the world outside. He thought about how fragile it all was, how easily it could break, how much depended on a single desk clerk deciding not to ask questions. And then Albert woke up, opened his eyes, smiled, said, "Morning." And for that moment, Edward let himself forget the fragility. For that moment, it was just two men waking up together in a rented room in the largest city in the world. And that was enough. They left separately. Edward first, walking downstairs and handing the key to the desk clerk, Thomas, who nodded without meeting his eyes. Albert, 10 minutes later, slipping out through the lobby while Thomas was occupied with another guest. On the street outside, they walked in opposite directions. Edward west toward Bloomsbury, Albert east toward the train station, back to Sheffield, back to the factory, back to a life that did not include rooms like the one they had just left. They would see each other again. Edward would bring him back to London 2 months later, and they would return to the Old Plough, room 9, same clerk, same script. They would do this for 3 years, until Albert met a woman he felt obligated to marry, and the letters stopped coming. But that morning, walking away from the hotel in opposite directions, neither of them knew how the story would end. They only knew that they had managed one night, one real night, together. And in 1885 London, that was victory enough. The thing about hotel clerks is that they held more power than anyone wanted to admit. A desk clerk could ruin your life with a single sentence. He could ask the wrong question at the wrong moment. He could write down a name when he should have looked away. He could call a constable instead of taking your money, and there was nothing you could do about it, because the power dynamic was absolute. You needed him to look the other way. He did not need you at all. But some of them understood. Some of them became, in their own quiet way, protectors of something the law wanted to destroy. Thomas Webb worked the evening desk at the Old Plough Hotel from 1882 until 1891. We know his name because Edward Carpenter mentioned him in 3 separate journal entries, always with a kind of careful gratitude. We know he was 52 years old in 1885 because the hotel employment records survived in the Westminster Archives, buried in a box of miscellaneous business documents that no one thought to destroy. We know he had worked in hotels for 30 years, that he had a wife and 2 daughters in Islington, and that he earned 16 shillings a week plus whatever extra he collected in tips and discreetly accepted bribes. We know he understood the code because men kept coming back. The Old Plough was not the cheapest hotel in London. It was not the most convenient, but it was safe, and safety was worth the extra shilling you slipped across the desk when Thomas turned the registry book toward you. Edward described him as a man with tired eyes and steady hands. He wrote that Thomas had a way of looking at you when you walked in with another man that made you feel for just a moment less alone. Not quite approval, not quite acknowledgement, just a kind of recognition that what you were doing was difficult, and he would not make it harder. In December of 1886, Edward brought a different man to the old plough, not Albert, a man named George Hookin, a steelworker from Sheffield, younger than Albert, with dark eyes and a nervous laugh. It was their second time meeting. They had exchanged letters for months, careful letters that said almost nothing directly, but everything between the lines. George had never done this before, never been to London with another man, never walked into a hotel lobby with intent. Edward could see the fear on his face as they stood outside in the December cold, fog so thick you could barely see across the street. George kept shifting his weight from foot to foot. His hands were shaking, not from the cold. Edward told him to wait at the pub across the street, told him to count to 200 slowly and then come upstairs, room 14, knock twice. Edward went in alone. Thomas was at the desk, same tired eyes, same careful expression. Edward signed the registry, paid the 4 shillings. Thomas handed him the key without a word. But as Edward turned to go upstairs, Thomas said quietly, "Your friend will want to use the side staircase. Less traffic." Edward stopped, looked back. Thomas was already attending to the ledger, writing something in his careful clerk's hand, not meeting Edward's eyes. It was the first time Thomas had ever acknowledged aloud what was happening, the first time he had broken the script of plausible deniability. And in doing so, he had given Edward something more valuable than a room. He had given him confirmation that he was not imagining the safety, that Thomas knew and knowing had chosen to help. Edward wrote about that moment in his journal that night. He wrote that he stood in the stairwell for a full minute afterward, holding the key, trying not to cry. Small kindnesses break you open when you have lived too long without them. That is a truth that crosses centuries. You can be strong for years, careful for years, armored for years, and then someone shows you a moment of unexpected gentleness and everything cracks. George arrived 10 minutes later. Used the side staircase like Thomas had suggested. Knocked twice on the door of room 14. Edward let him in. George stood just inside the door, still wearing his coat, looking around the room as if he expected it to be a trap. Edward had to talk him through it, had to explain that the door locked, that Thomas would not come upstairs, that no one was going to knock, that they had hours, not stolen minutes, that it was safe to take off his coat. George did not believe him at first. He kept his coat on for 20 minutes, standing near the window, looking down at the street below, as if memorizing an escape route. Edward sat on the edge of the bed and waited. Did not push, just waited. Finally, George turned away from the window, said, "I do not know how to do this." Edward said, "Neither do I." It was a lie. Edward had done this dozens of times by then, but it was also true, because every time was different, and fear does not diminish with practice. You just learn to carry it better. George took off his coat, sat down on the bed beside Edward. They talked for an hour before anything else happened. Talked about Sheffield, about the factory, about George's family who thought he was in London looking for work. Talked about everything except what they were doing in that room. And then, slowly, they stopped talking. Edward did not write details about that night in his journal. He was careful about that. He wrote around it, the way you write around something too precious or too fragile to put into words. He wrote that George fell asleep near midnight with his head on Edward's shoulder. He wrote that he stayed awake for a long time, listening to George breathe, thinking about all the men who had never had this, who had wanted it and never found it, who had died without ever spending a night beside someone they loved. He wrote, "The cruelty is not that we are forbidden from loving. The cruelty is that we are forbidden from resting, from the simple animal comfort of sleep beside another warm body. They have made even that into a crime." In the morning, George left first. Edward waited 15 minutes and then went downstairs. Thomas was still at the desk. He had worked a double shift. His eyes were even more tired than usual. Edward returned the key. Thomas took it without comment. Then he said, very quietly, "Your friend looked better this morning than he did last night." Edward nodded, did not trust himself to speak. Thomas went back to his ledger. Edward walked out into the December cold. And that was the transaction. A room. A night. A small conspiracy of silence that kept two men safe for a few hours. Thomas Webb was not unique. There were other clerks like him, scattered across London, men who had decided that discretion was not the same as ignorance, and that what happened in rented rooms was none of their concern as long as the guests paid and left quietly. But they were never the majority. For every Thomas Webb, there were a dozen clerks who would have called the police. Who did call the police? Who believed that enforcing the law was more important than protecting the desperate and the different. And you could not always tell the difference until it was too late. In March of 1887, a man named Frederick Park tried to rent a room at a hotel in Bloomsbury with his partner, a man named Ernest Bolton. They had been lovers for 2 years. They were both actors, accustomed to performance, good at playing roles. They thought they knew how to navigate the script. They were wrong. The desk clerk took one look at them and saw something he did not like. Maybe it was the way they stood too close. Maybe it was something in their eyes. Maybe he was just having a bad day and decided to make it someone else's problem. He told them there were no rooms available. They asked about the following night. He said the hotel was fully booked for the foreseeable future. They thanked him and left. 2 streets away, they were stopped by a policeman who asked to see their identification. The desk clerk had followed them out of the hotel and pointed them out to the constable. Had told him there was something suspicious about the 2 men, had suggested they might be criminals of some kind. The constable arrested them on suspicion of loitering for immoral purposes. They were held overnight at the Bow Street station. In the morning, they were released without charge because suspicion was not evidence, and the magistrate was not interested in prosecuting 2 men for the crime of trying to rent a hotel room. But the arrest went into the record. Their names were written down, and 6 months later, when they were arrested again for appearing in public in women's clothing, for performing in drag at a private party that was raided by police, that earlier arrest was brought up in court as evidence of a pattern of immoral behaviour. Frederick Park and Ernest Bolton were prosecuted under the same law that had been used to convict John Parker and William Matthews. The trial became a public spectacle. Newspapers covered every detail. Doctors testified about their bodies. Police testified about their behaviour. The prosecutor described them as a danger to public decency. They were acquitted, ultimately, because the evidence was thin and the jury was not convinced that wearing women's clothing constituted gross indecency. But their lives were destroyed anyway. Their names were known. Their relationship was public. They could not work as actors anymore. They could not return to their families. They vanished into the margins of history, 2 more men erased by the act of being seen. And it started with a hotel clerk who decided to call the police instead of minding his own business. That was the risk. Every time, with every hotel, every clerk, every night. You were trusting a stranger with your life, and sometimes that stranger decided you did not deserve his discretion. So you learned to minimize the risk. You learned the patterns. You learned that younger clerks were more dangerous than older ones, because younger men were more likely to believe in rules, and older men were more likely to believe in pragmatism. You learned that clerks who had worked in the theatre district were safer than clerks who had worked in residential neighbourhoods, because theatre people understood performance and residential people understood propriety. You learned that the best time to check in was late evening, after 9 o'clock, when the lobby was quiet and the clerk was tired and wanted to finish his shift without complications. You learned that the worst time was early afternoon, when the hotel was busy and the manager might be watching. You learned to dress well, but not too well. Respectable enough to suggest you could pay, not so polished that you attracted attention. You learned to carry a book or a newspaper, something that suggested you were a traveller, a man of business, someone with a plausible reason to be renting a room. You learned never to arrive drunk, never to smell of perfume or cologne, never to laugh too loudly in the lobby, never to touch the other man in any way that could be noticed. You learned to perform heterosexuality so convincingly that even you almost believed it. And you learned that even when you did everything right, sometimes it was not enough. John Addington Symonds wrote about this in a private letter to Horatio Brown in 1888. The letter is in the Bristol Archives, catalogued under Brown's Correspondence, Box 7. Symonds described an incident at a hotel in Piccadilly where he had been refused a room despite having stayed there twice before without incident. He wrote that he had followed all the protocols, had done nothing differently, but the clerk had simply looked at him and said no. Symonds wrote, "I have begun to believe they can smell it on us, some quality we cannot disguise. Or perhaps it is simpler than that. Perhaps we are just unlucky. Unlucky. That was often what it came down to. The wrong clerk on the wrong night. The wrong question at the wrong moment. The wrong policeman walking past at the wrong time. Luck, which is another word for chaos, which is another word for living in a system designed to destroy you and hoping you can slip through the cracks. But here is what history books miss when they talk about persecution. They talk about the law. They talk about the arrests, the trials, the sentences. They talk about the big moments, the public scandals, the famous cases. They do not talk about the 1,000 small failures, the hotel lobbies where you were turned away, the desk clerks who looked at you with disgust, the nights you spent apart because you could not find a room, the exhaustion of performing normalcy every single day, the way it wore you down, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, one small humiliation at a time. That was the real persecution, not the arrests, the waiting for arrest, the knowledge that any moment could be the moment, the hypervigilance that never turned off, the way you learned to scan every room, every face, every stranger, looking for danger. George Ives wrote about this in his diary in 1890. He described attending a party in Bloomsbury where he met a man he liked, a man named Arthur who worked as a clerk in a government office. They talked for hours. They walked together along the embankment afterward, and George thought about asking if Arthur wanted to find a hotel, but he could not make himself say the words. He wrote, "I was too afraid, not of rejection, of the moment when we would have to walk into a lobby together and face whatever was waiting there. I have done it before. I will do it again. But tonight, I could not find the courage, and so we parted at Westminster Bridge, and I walked home alone." The next entry in the diary is blank. The entry after that says simply, "Still thinking about Arthur." They never saw each other again. George looked for him at parties for months afterward. Never found him. That was how it often ended. Not with arrests or scandals or grand tragedies. Just with two people who almost connected and then did not, because the obstacles were too great and the risks too high, and sometimes you just could not find the energy to fight through it all one more time. But some men kept fighting. Some men refused to let the obstacles win. They built the infrastructure of survival piece by piece, one hotel room at a time. By the early 1890s, the network had become more organized, not officially, never officially, but word traveled. Men shared information in private letters, in quiet conversations at parties, in coded phrases that meant nothing to outsiders and everything to those who knew. Certain hotels became known. The Old Plough on Oxford Street, Thomas Webb's domain. The Sussex on Jermyn Street, where the night clerk was a man named Peter who had a brother who was also, as the phrase went, musical. The boarding houses near Fitzroy Square, where the landladies were old suffragettes who believed privacy was a human right and asked no questions about their tenants. There was a bathhouse in Charing Cross that rented rooms upstairs, officially for men who wanted to bathe and then rest before continuing their journey, unofficially for men who wanted privacy for other reasons. The owner was a German immigrant named Klaus, who had seen worse things than two men sharing a bed, and did not much care what English law had to say about it. There were private rooms above certain pubs. There were lodging houses in Whitechapel where you could rent by the hour. There were apartments in Soho where the landlords had decided that morality was less profitable than tolerance. And there were private homes. Men of means, men like Edward Carpenter who owned property, began quietly offering spare rooms to friends who needed them. Not for money, for safety. For the simple reason that if you had a door that locked and a bed to share, and someone you cared about needed it, you gave it. Edward turned his home in Millthorpe into a kind of sanctuary. It was far from London, up in Derbyshire, but that was part of the point. Men could visit for weekends, for weeks, and no one in the village cared much about the private lives of city folk. Edward hosted dozens of men there over the years. Some were lovers, some were friends, some were strangers who had heard through the network that there was a place where they could rest without fear. He wrote about this in a letter to George Hookin in 1891. The letter survived in the Carpenter archives at Sheffield Central Library. He wrote, "I have become a kind of innkeeper for the weary and displaced. It is not what I imagine doing with my life, but it is perhaps the most useful thing I have done." That was the quiet revolution. Not the grand gestures, not the public protests, not the speeches or the manifestos. Just men creating small spaces of safety for each other, sharing information, protecting each other, building a network that existed only in trust and memory. The law wanted to isolate you, wanted to make you believe you were alone, abnormal, the only one. The network was the refusal of that isolation. Every hotel room successfully rented, every desk clerk who looked the way, every private home opened to a stranger was a small act of defiance, a way of saying, you are not alone, you are not abnormal, and you deserve to sleep beside someone you love without fear. But the network had gaps. It was fragile. It depended on individuals, and individuals could be arrested, could be threatened, could change their minds. Hotels that were safe one year were dangerous the next. Clerks who understood could be replaced by clerks who did not. The map was always shifting, always incomplete. And if you were poor, if you were working class, if you could not afford even the cheap hotels, the network barely reached you at all. Albert Fearnhoe, Edward's first love from Sheffield, could only afford to come to London twice a year. The train fare was expensive. The hotel room was expensive. Even the cheap rooms, the ones in Whitechapel and Soho, cost more than Albert made in a week at the factory. Edward paid for most of it, and even then it was a stretch. For men like Albert, men who worked with their hands for wages that barely covered rent and food, the hidden infrastructure of gay London might as well not have existed. They could not afford to participate. They could not afford the train fare to meet someone in the city. They could not afford the hotel rooms. They could not afford the risk of being seen because they could not afford to lose their jobs, and everyone in a small factory town knew everyone else's business. So they lived differently. They lived in snatched moments, in dark alleys, in fields outside town, in places where privacy was free because it was dangerous. They took risks that wealthier men did not have to take because they had no other options. And when they were caught, they suffered more. Because they could not afford lawyers, could not afford bail, could not afford the social capital that might have protected them. The law was supposed to be universal, but in practice it landed heaviest on the men who had the least. Edward was aware of this. He wrote about it often, the class dimension of persecution, the way queerness and poverty intersected to create a particular kind of vulnerability. He wrote that the network he was part of, the hotels and the private homes and the careful information sharing, was a privilege of education and income, and most men had neither. He tried to address it. He paid for Albert's train tickets. He paid for hotel rooms for other men who could not afford them. He opened his home to working-class men who needed a place to stay. But he also knew it was not enough. You could not solve a structural problem with individual charity. The law needed to change. The society needed to change. But in 1891, that change felt impossibly far away. The law was getting stricter, not looser. Police were increasing patrols in parks, in public toilets, in areas known for men meeting other men. The trials were getting more public, more brutal. Oscar Wilde's trial was still 4 years away, but the machinery that would destroy him was already being built. And in that climate, the hotels mattered more than ever, because they were one of the few places where you could be for a few hours something other than afraid. In the spring of 1892, Edward Carpenter met a man who would change his understanding of what safety could mean. His name was George Merrill. He was 22 years old. He had grown up in the slums of Sheffield, orphaned at 7, raised in a series of workhouses and foster homes that taught him to survive by charm and quick thinking. He had no education to speak of. He could barely read. He had worked as a factory hand, a street sweeper, a barman, and half a dozen other jobs that paid just enough to keep him alive. He was also the most beautiful man Edward had ever seen. Not conventionally handsome, not polished, but alive in a way that made everyone else seem half asleep. He laughed easily. He touched people when he talked to them, quick casual touches on the arm or shoulder, the kind of physical ease that Edward had spent his whole life trying to learn and never quite managed. They met at a socialist meeting in Sheffield. George was there because the meeting hall was warm and they were serving tea. Edward was there to give a lecture about industrial labour reform. Afterward, George walked up to him and said, "That was the most words I have ever heard anyone use to say that rich people are bastards." Edward laughed. They started talking. They talked for 2 hours, standing in the cold outside the meeting hall, and then George said he had to go. He had work in the morning. Edward asked if they could meet again. George shrugged and said sure, why not? 3 weeks later, Edward brought George to London for the first time. George had never been to London, had never been more than 15 miles from Sheffield in his entire life. The train ride alone was an event. George pressed his face against the window like a child, watching the countryside roll past, asking Edward questions about everything they saw. What kind of trees were those? What were those buildings? Why were there so many cows? Edward found it charming, also slightly heartbreaking, because it made visible how small George's world had been, how little opportunity he had ever had to see anything beyond the narrow radius of survival. When they arrived at King's Cross Station, George stopped just outside the terminal doors and stared. The noise, the crowds, the sheer density of people and carriages and shouting vendors and newspaper boys and street musicians. It was overwhelming. Edward touched his elbow gently and said, "We can go back if you want, if it is too much." George shook his head, grinned, said, "Are you joking? This is brilliant." They walked to the old plough. It was early evening, not yet dark, the streets full of people heading home from work. George kept stopping to look at things. Shop windows, street performers, a man selling roasted chestnuts from a cart. Edward had to keep gently steering him forward, or they would never have made it to the hotel. When they reached the old plough, Edward stopped outside and explained the script. Wait at the pub across the street. Count to 200. Use the side staircase. Knock twice. George listened with a strange expression on his face. Not nervous exactly. More like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Then he said, "Why do we have to pretend?" Edward blinked, said, "Because it is safer that way." George said, "Safer for who?" It was not a rhetorical question. He genuinely wanted to know. And Edward did not have a good answer. He said something about discretion, about not attracting attention, about how the world worked. George nodded slowly, but Edward could tell he was not convinced. They followed the script anyway. Edward went in first. Thomas was at the desk, same as always. Edward signed the registry, paid the 4 shillings, took the key to room 9, went upstairs. George arrived 10 minutes later, knocked twice. Edward opened the door. George walked in, looked around the room and said, "This is it?" Edward said, "What do you mean?" George said, "This is what you have been doing for 10 years, sneaking into cheap hotels and pretending not to know each other." Edward felt something tighten in his chest. He said, "It is better than nothing." George sat down on the edge of the bed. He looked at Edward for a long moment, and there was something in his eyes that Edward had not seen before. Not pity, exactly. More like recognition, like he was seeing something about Edward that Edward had been trying not to see about himself. George said, "You think you do not deserve better than this." Edward started to protest, but the words died in his throat. Because George was right. Somewhere along the way, Edward had stopped imagining that anything else was possible. He had built his life around stolen hours and careful scripts and the constant management of risk, and he had convinced himself that this was freedom, that this was enough. George stood up, crossed the room, put his hand on Edward's cheek, rough calloused fingers against skin, and said, "You deserve better than this." Edward kissed him, or George kissed him. Later, Edward would not be able to remember who moved first. He only remembered the feeling of being seen, really seen, maybe for the first time in his life. They spent that night in room 9, and the night after, and the night after that. George stayed in London for a week, and by the end of it, Edward had made a decision. He asked George to move in with him. Not in London, in Millthorpe. The house in Derbyshire, far from the city, far from the laws that felt closer and more dangerous with every passing year. He offered George a life, a real life. Not stolen hours, not hotel rooms, not performances of plausibility. An actual shared existence. George said yes without hesitating. He had nothing to leave behind in Sheffield. No family, no career, no ties that could not be broken. Within a month, he had moved into Edward's house, and they lived together for the rest of Edward's life. 40 years. They lived together for 40 years. Openly. In a small village where everyone knew and no one said anything, because rural England in the 1890s had different rules than urban England, and if you were discreet enough and contributed to the community and did not make a fuss, people mostly left you alone. But before they left London, before they went to Millthorpe, they had one more night at the old plough. It was George's idea. He said he wanted to do it differently this time. No script, no pretending. He wanted to walk in together, sign the registry together, go upstairs together. He wanted to see what happened. Edward was terrified. He tried to explain why it was a bad idea, tried to list all the ways it could go wrong. But George was insistent, and there was something in his insistence that made Edward want to believe it was possible. So they did it. They walked into the lobby of the old plough together, shoulder to shoulder, not pretending to be anything other than what they were. Thomas was at the desk. He looked up, saw them. His face did not change. He turned the registry book toward them. Edward signed his name. George could not write well enough to sign his own, so Edward wrote "and guest" in the second line. Thomas handed them the key to room 9. Said, "Good evening, gentlemen." That was all. No questions, no judgment, no police, just a transaction, a room for the night. As they walked upstairs, George leaned close and whispered, "See, nothing bad happened." Edward wanted to say that they had been lucky, that it could have gone differently, that Thomas Webb was an exception and not the rule. But he did not say any of that. He just held George's hand in the stairwell where no one could see and felt something in his chest that he had not felt in years. Hope. That was what it was. The dangerous, fragile thing he had stopped letting himself feel. They left London the next morning, took the train north to Derbyshire, started building the life they would share until Edward's death in 1929. But the hotel room stayed with Edward. He wrote about it years later in his autobiography, published posthumously in 1916. He wrote, "That last night at the old plough was the night I understood that survival was not the same as living. I had been surviving for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without apology. George taught me that, and Thomas Webb, in his quiet way, allowed it." Thomas Webb died in 1894. He was 59 years old. The The cause of death listed in the parish records was pneumonia, which was the Victorian way of saying his lungs gave out, probably from years of breathing London air. He was buried in a churchyard in Islington, a modest grave marked with a simple stone that gave his name and dates and nothing else. No one except his family attended the funeral. No monument was raised to his memory. No historical marker notes his existence. But in the private letters and journals of dozens of men who survived those years, his name appears. Always briefly, always with a kind of careful gratitude. The clerk at the old plough who understood. Thomas, the man who looked the other way. He saved lives, not dramatically, not heroically, just by doing his job with a little more compassion than the law required, by deciding that privacy mattered more than enforcement, by choosing, night after night, to be the kind of person who helped rather than harmed. That was heroism in 1890s London. Not grand gestures, small ones. The decision to turn a registry book toward two men without asking why. The decision to mention a side staircase. The decision to say good evening instead of calling the police. History does not remember men like Thomas Webb, but the men who survived because of him did. And they wrote it down. And now you and I are sitting here in a quiet room more than a century later, and we know his name. That is a kind of immortality. But not every clerk was Thomas Webb. And as the 1890s wore on, the safe hotels became harder to find. The Cleveland Street scandal broke in 1889. A male brothel in central London, frequented by aristocrats and working-class men alike, was raided by police. Dozens of men were arrested. Several fled the country. The newspapers covered every detail with breathless moral outrage. The scandal went all the way to the royal family, with rumours that Prince Albert Victor had been a client, though nothing was ever proven. The scandal changed the climate. It made the public aware that this hidden world existed, and awareness bred paranoia. Hotels became more cautious. Clerks became more suspicious. The police increased patrols. The network contracted. Suddenly, hotels that had been reliably safe were turning men away. The old plough stopped taking guests without luggage. The Sussex hired a new manager who instituted a policy requiring identification. The boarding houses near Fitzroy Square started asking more questions. The infrastructure was collapsing, not because of a change in the law, but because of a change in public attention. And attention was more dangerous than legislation. Laws could be evaded. Attention made evasion impossible. John Addington Symonds wrote about this in a letter to Edward Carpenter in 1890. The letter is in the Carpenter Archives at Sheffield. Symonds described trying to rent a room at 3 different hotels in one night and being refused at all 3. He wrote, "The city is closing its doors. I do not know where men are supposed to go now. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps they want us to disappear." Some men did disappear. They left London entirely, moved to the countryside or to the continent, where the laws were different and the surveillance less intense. Some men married women and tried to live the lives expected of them, burying the parts of themselves that did not fit. Some men stopped trying altogether, accepted loneliness as the price of safety, and lived quiet, diminished lives. But some men refused to disappear. They found new ways to adapt, new strategies, new hiding places. Private apartments became more important. If you could afford to rent a flat, you could control who came and went. You did not need a desk clerk's permission. You did not need to follow a script. You could have visitors, and as long as the neighbours did not complain, no one would notice. Certain neighbourhoods became known as safe. Bloomsbury, with its artists and writers and bohemians who were used to eccentricity. Soho, with its immigrant communities and cheap rents and general atmosphere of people minding their own business. Whitechapel, where poverty and desperation created a kind of anonymity that wealth could never buy. And there were the Molly houses, private homes, usually run by older men or women who had been part of this world for decades, where you could go for an evening, for a night, for however long you needed. They were part social club, part brothel, part sanctuary. The good ones were safe. The bad ones were traps, places where the police paid informants to gather names and evidence. You had to know which was which. You had to trust the network. And the network, like everything else, was only as strong as the people who built it. There was a woman named Martha who ran a boarding house in Whitechapel in the early 1890s. She was in her 60s, a widow, a former music hall performer who had seen enough of life to have opinions about hypocrisy. She rented rooms by the night, no questions, no judgment, for half the price of the respectable hotels. Her place was not nice. The rooms were small and damp. The beds were lumpy. The walls were thin enough that you could hear every sound from the rooms on either side. But it was safe, and safety mattered more than comfort. Men came to Martha's from all over London: factory workers, shop clerks, servants who had a rare night off, men who could not afford the old plough or the Sussex, men who needed a place to go and had nowhere else. Martha treated them with a gruff kindness. She did not pry. She did not gossip. She kept a pot of tea on the stove and let men sit in her kitchen if they needed to talk. She had a policy that no one was allowed to be cruel in her house, and if you broke that rule, you were out, and you did not come back. We know about Martha because she appears in several memoirs written by men who survived those years. She is always mentioned briefly, almost in passing, but always with affection. Martha in Whitechapel, who kept us alive. The old woman on Bedford Street who let rooms. The landlady who never asked questions. Her real name might not have been Martha. It might have been a nickname, a code name, the kind of thing you called someone when you did not want to put their real identity in writing. But the name stuck. And now, more than a century later, we still call her Martha. She died sometime in the late 1890s. There is no death certificate that matches her description, no burial record, no estate inventory. She vanished from the historical record the way most working-class women vanished, leaving behind only the memories of the people whose lives she touched. But those memories survived. And they tell us something important. They tell us that the infrastructure of gay survival in Victorian London was not just built by men, it was built by women too. By landladies who chose not to enforce moral codes they did not believe in. By housekeepers who looked the other way. By women who understood that the same society that oppressed gay men also oppressed them, and that solidarity sometimes meant breaking the rules together. That is something the history books miss. They focus on the famous men, the writers and poets and aristocrats. They focus on Oscar Wilde and John Addington Symonds and Edward Carpenter. They miss the Marthas, the Thomas Webbs, the people who were not famous, who did not write books, who simply did the daily work of making survival possible. But survival was not the same as joy, and by the mid-1890s, joy was becoming harder to find. The Wilde trials began in April 1895. Oscar Wilde sued the Marquis of Queensberry for libel after Queensberry accused him of being a sodomite. The trial was supposed to vindicate Wilde. Instead, it destroyed him. The prosecution brought forward a parade of young men who testified that Wilde had taken them to hotels, the Savoy, the Albemarle, respectable establishments in expensive neighborhoods. The hotel staff were subpoenaed. Chambermaids testified about finding stains on sheets. Desk clerks testified about seeing Wilde enter rooms with young men. Detailed testimony about which rooms, which dates, which hotels. The hotels became evidence. The rooms became crime scenes. The entire hidden infrastructure that had allowed men to survive was dragged into public view and put on trial. Wilde was convicted of gross indecency, sentenced to 2 years of hard labour. He served the full sentence at Reading Jail, and when he was released in 1897, he was a broken man. He fled to France. He died in exile 3 years later, penniless and alone. The trials had a chilling effect that lasted for decades. Hotels across London instituted new policies. No single men sharing rooms, no guests without luggage, no check-ins after 10 in the evening. Identification required, references required, letters of introduction required. The infrastructure collapsed almost overnight. The network that had taken years to build, that had relied on trust and discretion and the quiet cooperation of people like Thomas Webb and Martha, simply stopped working. Men stopped trying to rent hotel rooms together. It was too dangerous. The risk was too high. If Oscar Wilde, one of the most famous writers in England, could be destroyed, what chance did ordinary men have? So they found other ways. They met in parks after dark. They used public toilets, those grim spaces that became the last refuge when every other option was closed. They went to the continent, to Paris or Berlin or Rome, cities where the laws were different and the surveillance less intense. Or they stopped meeting at all. Edward Carpenter wrote about the Wilde trials in a private letter to George Hookin in May 1895. The letter is in the Sheffield archives. He wrote, "They have taken away the last pretence of safety. Every hotel in London is a trap now. Every desk clerk is a potential witness. I do not know how men are supposed to live." But then he wrote something else. He wrote, "And yet we will find a way. We always have. They can take away the hotels, but they cannot take away the need. And need is stronger than law." He was right. Men did find ways. They adapted. They built new networks, quieter ones, more careful ones. They learned to host each other in private homes. They learned to travel farther, to smaller towns where they were unknown. They learned to wait longer, to be more patient, to accept that love would happen in stolen moments rather than full nights. It was not the same as before. It was harder, lonelier, more dangerous. But it was something. It was survival. And survival, even diminished, was still defiance. The years after Wilde were the quiet years, the careful years, the years when men learned to make themselves invisible in ways they had not needed to before. If you were trying to find a hotel room with another man in 1896, in the aftermath of the trials, you had to become an expert in reading absence. Not what was there, but what was missing. Hotels that no longer advertised in certain newspapers, desk clerks who no longer made eye contact, the small signs that a place had decided discretion was too expensive and safety was someone else's problem. You learned to look for the establishments that were struggling, the hotels that could not afford to turn away paying customers, the ones in neighborhoods that were declining, where respectability was a luxury they could no longer maintain. These were not pleasant places, but they were possible. There was a hotel on Drury Lane called the Colonnade that became quietly known in 1896 and 1897. It was a shabby place, 4 stories of peeling paint and questionable plumbing, tucked between a pawn shop and a gin palace. The front entrance was narrow, easy to miss if you were not looking for it. The lobby smelled of mildew and tobacco and something that might have been cat urine. But the night clerk was a man named Arthur Bingham, and Arthur Bingham had a cousin who had been arrested in the Cleveland Street scandal. The cousin had served 6 months in prison and come out hollowed, broken, a different person. Arthur had visited him once during those 6 months. Once was enough. He had decided then that he would not contribute to making anyone else disappear. So at the Colonnade, if you knew to ask for a room with 2 beds and Arthur was working the desk, he would give you a room with 1 bed and charge you for 2. He would write 2 names in the registry, even if only 1 person signed. He would tell you which rooms had locks that actually worked and which stairwells the other guests did not use. This information travelled in whispers, in coded conversations at parties, in letters that said things like, "If you find yourself near the theatre district," or "There is a place I once stayed that was adequate." The network rebuilt itself, but it rebuilt quietly, in language that could be denied if necessary. A man named Lawrence Houseman knew about the Colonnade. Houseman was a writer and illustrator, younger brother of the poet A.E. Houseman, and part of a circle of artists and socialists who were trying to imagine a different kind of world. He had been to the Colonnade 3 times in 1897 with a man named Herbert Pollitt, an artist who specialized in botanical drawings. Houseman wrote about these visits in his private papers, which were sealed until 1958 and are now held at the Street Library. He described the hotel as profoundly depressing, the kind of place where you could hear arguments through the walls, and the sheets were clean but worn so thin they were almost translucent. But he also wrote that it was the only place he knew in central London where he could spend a full night with Herbert without feeling like he was walking into a trap. He wrote about Arthur Bingham with particular warmth. He described him as a man with the face of someone who had seen too much and decided to be kind anyway. Houseman wrote that Arthur never smiled, never made small talk, never gave any indication that he knew what was happening in the rooms he rented. But once, when Houseman was signing the registry, Arthur said quietly, "The lock on room 12 sticks. You have to lift the handle when you turn the key." Houseman wrote, "It was such a small thing, instructions about a lock. But I understood what he was really saying. He was saying, I am giving you a room where the door will hold, where you will be safe. It was the kindest thing anyone had said to me in months." That was what passed for safety in 1897. A room with a lock that worked. A clerk who did not ask questions. The knowledge that you could sleep through the night without listening for footsteps in the hallway. But even the colonnade was not entirely safe. In January of 1898, 2 men were arrested there, not in their room, in the lobby. They had made the mistake of arriving together, of standing too close while one of them signed the registry, of looking at each other in a way that a constable walking past happened to notice. The constable came in, asked to see their identification, asked why they needed a room, asked if they were related, asked if they were business associates, asked the questions that had no good answers. And when the answers were not convincing, he arrested them both for loitering with intent to commit an immoral act. Arthur Bingham tried to intervene, told the constable they were paying guests who had not broken any laws. The constable told him to mind his business, or he would be arrested too. Arthur stepped back. Later he would tell people he still had nightmares about that moment, about choosing his own safety over theirs. The 2 men spent the night in jail. In the morning, they were released without charge, because intent was hard to prove, and the magistrate was not interested in prosecuting people for standing too close in a hotel lobby. But their names were recorded, and 3 months later, one of them lost his position as a clerk in a law office because someone had made inquiries about his character and discovered the arrest record. That was how it worked. You did not need to be convicted to be destroyed. You just needed to be noticed. The colonnade survived another 2 years. Then the building was sold, converted into a warehouse, and Arthur Bingham disappeared from the historical record. Another name that survived only in private letters and coded references. Another person who tried to help, and eventually could not anymore. By 1899, finding a hotel room with another man in London required more than knowledge. It required money, connections, and a willingness to travel outside the city entirely. The truly wealthy had always had more options. If you owned property, you did not need hotels. If you had enough money, you could rent private accommodations, entire apartments or houses for a weekend or a week, places where you controlled who came and went. If you had connections on the continent, you could simply leave England altogether. But for ordinary men with jobs and limited incomes and responsibilities they could not abandon, the options were shrinking to almost nothing. Some men started taking trains out to coastal towns. Brighton became known as a place where you could find lodgings more easily than in London. The seaside boarding houses catered to tourists, and tourists were transient by definition. 2 men sharing a room in Brighton were just travellers. No one looked twice. Folkestone, Margate, Hastings. Small seaside towns where the landladies were used to men arriving without wives, where single gentlemen were common enough not to attract attention. The train fare was an expense, and it meant you had less time together because you had to travel there and back. But it was safer than London. Edward Carpenter brought George Merrill to Brighton in the summer of 1899. They stayed at a guest house on the seafront, a modest place run by an elderly widow who served kippers for breakfast and did not ask personal questions. They had a room overlooking the ocean, and Edward wrote in his journal that it was the first time in years he had been able to walk down a street holding another man's arm without calculating the risk. He wrote, "Brighton is not paradise, but it is close enough for men like us. For 2 days, we were simply two people on holiday. That should not feel radical, but it does. They went back to Brighton 3 more times over the next 2 years. The same guest house, the same room, the same elderly widow who greeted them like returning guests and never once indicated she found anything unusual about 2 men travelling together. But Brighton was not accessible to most men. The train fare alone was more than many people made in a week, and even if you could afford it, you had to have the kind of job that allowed you to disappear for a weekend without explanation. For working-class men, for men like George Merrill had been before Edward, the options were even more limited. You could not afford to travel. You could not afford hotels, even shabby ones. You could barely afford rent on the room you already had. So you used the parks. You used the public spaces. You used the places where privacy was free, because it was dark and no one was watching. And you accepted the risk, because risk was better than nothing. Hampstead Heath at night. The paths along the Thames embankment after midnight. Certain sections of Hyde Park, where the gaslights did not reach. These were the places where working-class men went when hotels were impossible. And these were the places where the police waited. In 1898, the Metropolitan Police established what they called the Morality Patrol, plainclothes officers whose job was to monitor public spaces for immoral behaviour. They worked at night, dressed as ordinary civilians, and they arrested dozens of men every month. The arrests were usually for gross indecency or solicitation, though often the evidence was thin to non-existent. It was enough for an officer to claim he had witnessed suspicious behaviour. The arrested man would be held overnight, brought before a magistrate in the morning, and either fined or sentenced to a short jail term. The whole process took less than 24 hours. By the time anyone who might have helped even knew about it, it was over. And because these were working-class men, men without resources or connections, no one paid attention. The newspapers did not cover these arrests. There were no sensational trials, just a steady stream of men disappearing into the legal system and coming out broken. One of those men was named William Thompson. We know about him because he wrote a letter to Edward Carpenter in 1899 asking for help, and Edward kept the letter. It is in the Carpenter archives at Sheffield, filed in a folder labelled Correspondence Miscellaneous. William was a porter at King's Cross Station. He was arrested in Hampstead Heath in August of 1899. The arresting officer claimed William had propositioned him, which William insisted was false. The officer had been standing in a secluded area of the heath, dressed in civilian clothes, and when William walked past, the officer had initiated a conversation. They had talked for perhaps 5 minutes. The officer asked if William wanted to go somewhere more private. William said no and started to walk away. The officer arrested him. William was convicted based solely on the officer's testimony, sentenced to 3 months of hard labour. He lost his job at the station. When he was released, he could not find other work because he now had a criminal record. He ended up sleeping rough, living on the street, surviving on charity and occasional day labour. He wrote to Edward because someone had told him Edward helped men in trouble. The letter was written in a shaky hand on cheap paper, and it asked for money to pay for a train ticket to Liverpool, where William had a sister who might take him in. Edward sent the money. He also wrote back a long letter full of sympathy and practical advice about how to survive, where to go for help, which charitable organisations might provide assistance. The letter survives in William's response, where he quoted parts of it back to Edward in gratitude. But then there is no more record of William Thompson. No other letters. No mention in Edward's journals. He vanished, like so many others, into the margins of history where the archives do not reach. That was the reality for most men. Not the famous cases, not the scandalous trials, not the stories that made it into newspapers. Just ordinary people trying to find a moment of connection and being destroyed for it. Quietly, invisibly, without anyone noticing or caring. And the hotels, which had once been a refuge however imperfect, were no longer even an option for men like William. They required money he did not have. They required the ability to perform respectability convincingly enough to pass a desk clerk's scrutiny. They required things that poverty made impossible. So the Victorian compromise, if you could call it that, became this. If you had money and education and connections, you could find ways to survive. You could travel to Brighton or the continent. You could rent private apartments. You could navigate the shrinking network of safe spaces. It was difficult, but it was possible. If you did not have those things, you were pushed into the shadows entirely, into the parks and the public toilets and the dangerous spaces where privacy was free but risk was total. And when you were caught, no one would help you. No one would even know. That was the class dimension of persecution, and it has never really changed. The law claims to be universal, but enforcement has always been selective. The wealthy and connected could usually find ways around it. The poor and vulnerable bore the full weight. Edward Carpenter understood this better than most of the men in his circle. He had money from a family inheritance, enough to live comfortably without working. He had education, connections, social capital. He could have used all of that to protect himself, to keep a safe distance from the men who were more vulnerable. Instead, he spent years trying to build bridges. He paid for train tickets and hotel rooms and legal fees for men who had none of those resources. He opened his home in Millthorpe to working-class men who needed somewhere to stay. He wrote essays and pamphlets arguing that the law was unjust and needed to change. But he also knew it was not enough. You could not solve a structural problem with individual charity, no matter how generous. The system needed to change. And in 1899, that seemed further away than ever. The new century was coming. There was a sense in the air that things might be different in the 1900s, that the Victorian obsession with moral purity might relax, that the next generation might be less cruel than this one, that hope turned out to be mostly wishful thinking. The laws did not change. The persecution continued. If anything, it intensified in the early years of the 20th century as moral panic about degeneration and national decline became entangled with fears about masculinity and empire. But the network survived. Quietly, carefully. Men kept finding each other. They kept sharing information about which places were safe and which were not. They kept building small infrastructures of survival, and occasionally, very occasionally, something beautiful happened. In the autumn of 1900, a young man named Montague Glover arrived in London from Birmingham. He was 19 years old, the son of a factory foreman, and he had come to the city to find work as a clerk. He had also come to find something else, though he would not have known how to name it yet. He had known since he was 14 that he was different, that the feelings he had toward other boys were not the feelings he was supposed to have. He had spent 5 years trying to ignore those feelings, trying to be normal, trying to convince himself that it would pass. It did not pass. And finally, at 19, he decided he would rather know the truth about himself than spend his whole life pretending. Someone in Birmingham, a friend of a friend, had told him that there were places in London where men like him could go. Not addresses exactly, just hints. Neighbourhoods, types of establishments, the kind of information that could only be shared in code. Montague arrived in London on a Friday evening in October. He had a suitcase with 2 changes of clothes and 17 shillings in his pocket. He had the name of a boarding house in Clerkenwell, where he could rent a room for 3 shillings a week. He also had the vague understanding that somewhere in this city of 4 million people, there were others like him. And if he was brave enough, he might find them. He spent the first 3 days exploring, walking through neighbourhoods, watching people, trying to learn how to see what was hidden. He quickly discovered that he had no idea what he was looking for. Everyone looked ordinary. Everyone looked like they belonged. He did not know how to tell the difference between men who were like him and men who were not. On the 4th day, he went to a bookshop in Bloomsbury that someone had mentioned as a place where you could find certain kinds of literature. The shop was small, dusty, packed floor to ceiling with books. The owner was an elderly man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers who looked like he had not left the shop in decades. Montague browsed for an hour, not sure what he was looking for, until the owner approached him and asked quietly if he was interested in poetry. Montague said yes, even though he barely read poetry and had no strong feelings about it. The owner disappeared into the back room and returned with a slim volume. The cover was plain, no title. He handed it to Montague and said, "This is not for sale, but you may read it here if you like." Montague opened it. The first poem was by Walt Whitman. The second was by John Addington Symonds. The third was by someone named Edward Carpenter. He read for 2 hours, standing in the corner of the shop, and by the end of it, something inside him had cracked open. Because here, in these poems, were men writing openly about loving other men, about desire and beauty and connection, about the exact things Montague had spent 5 years believing were unspeakable. When he handed the book back, the shop owner said, "There is a gathering on Saturday evenings, in Fitzroy Square. I cannot tell you more than that, unless you tell me you are looking." Montague said, "I am looking." The owner wrote an address on a scrap of paper, handed it to him, said, "Do not arrive before 9. Do not bring anyone who has not been invited." Montague went. Of course he went. He was 19 and desperate and brave in the way that people are brave when they have nothing to lose. The address was a townhouse in Fitzroy Square, respectable looking from the outside, curtains drawn, no indication that anything unusual was happening inside. Montague knocked. A man answered, middle-aged, well-dressed, looked him up and down and asked who had sent him. Montague gave the name of the bookshop owner. The man nodded and let him in. Inside was a room full of men, 20, perhaps 30. Some young, some old, some well-dressed, some shabby. They were drinking tea and wine, talking, laughing, sitting close together in ways that men did not sit in public. Montague stood just inside the door, overwhelmed. One of the men noticed him, came over, introduced himself as Lawrence, asked if this was Montague's first time. Montague nodded, unable to speak. Lawrence smiled, said, "It gets easier. Come sit down. Let me introduce you to some people." Montague spent 4 hours at that gathering in Fitzroy Square. He met a painter named Charles, a civil servant named Robert, a medical student named James. He met men who worked in factories and men who had family money. He met men who had been living this way for decades and men who had only just figured out what they were looking for. And for the first time in his life, he did not feel alone. Near midnight, as the gathering was winding down, Lawrence pulled him aside and said, "Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" Montague said he had a room in Clerkenwell, a boarding house, respectable, cheap. Lawrence nodded. Then he said, "And if you wanted to bring someone with you, would that be possible?" Montague understood what he was being asked. He said no. The landlady was strict. No visitors after 8. Certainly no overnight guests. Lawrence said, "Then you need to know about the places where you can go. There are not many left. But there are some." He described the colonnade on Drury Lane, said it was shabby but safe, or as safe as anywhere could be. Said the night clerk understood the situation and would not cause trouble. Said it cost 4 shillings for a room, extra if you wanted one with a proper lock. He also mentioned a boarding house in Soho, run by a woman named Agnes, who asked no questions and charged by the night. And he mentioned Brighton, though he said that was only practical if you had money and time, which most people did not. Montague listened carefully, committed it to memory. He did not have anyone to bring to a hotel yet, but he understood that he was being given something valuable. A map. Instructions for navigating a world he had not known existed a week ago. At the door, as he was leaving, Lawrence said, "Come back next Saturday if you want. You are welcome here." Montague walked home through the empty streets of Bloomsbury, past the shuttered shops, and the street lamps casting yellow pools of gaslight on wet pavement. It was past 1 in the morning. The city was quiet except for the occasional rattle of a late carriage and the distant sound of someone singing drunk outside a pub. He thought about the men he had met, the ease with which they had talked to each other, touched each other, existed together without pretense. He thought about the map Lawrence had given him, the knowledge of where to go when you needed somewhere to go. And he thought about the fact that this world had been here the whole time, invisible unless you knew how to look for it. That there were men all over London, all over England, living secret parallel lives, building networks and sharing information and protecting each other in small, quiet ways. It should not have to be this way. He knew that even then, at 19, with almost no experience. It should not require secret gatherings and coded information and maps to hotels that might or might not be safe. It should be simple. Two people who wanted to be together should be able to be together, but simple was not an option. So you learnt the complicated version. You learned the codes and the scripts and the networks. You learned how to be invisible and how to find others who were also invisible. You learned that survival required a kind of constant vigilance that most people would never have to develop. Montague went back to the gathering the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that, he became part of the network. He learned more about the hidden geography of gay London, the places you could go and the places you could not, the clerks who understood, and the clerks who would turn you in. 3 months later, he met a man named David at one of those Saturday gatherings. David was 23, a schoolteacher from Surrey who came into London every other weekend. They talked for hours that first night, discovered they both loved music, both played piano badly, both had the same dry sense of humour about the absurdity of their situation. They started meeting regularly. Every other weekend when David came to London, they would spend Saturday evening at the gathering in Fitzroy Square and then walk together through the empty streets afterward, talking until dawn. By January, they wanted more than conversation. Montague remembered what Lawrence had told him about the colonnade. He suggested it to David, who looked nervous but agreed. They decided to try on a Friday night in late January, a night when David would be in London anyway and could claim he was staying with a friend if anyone from Surrey asked. They met outside the hotel at 9. It was raining, that fine, cold London rain that soaks through everything. The street was mostly empty, just a few people hurrying home through the wet. Montague went in first, following the script he had learned. The lobby was exactly as shabby as Lawrence had described. Peeling wallpaper, a desk with water-stained wood, the smell of damp and old tobacco. The clerk looked up. He was not Arthur Bingham. Arthur had left months earlier, replaced by a younger man named Peter, who had the same tired eyes and the same willingness to look away from things he did not want to see. Montague signed the registry with his own name, asked for a room for the night. Peter quoted him 4 shillings. Montague paid. Peter handed him a key to room 7. As Montague turned to go upstairs, Peter said quietly, "The lock works if you lift the handle." The same words Arthur used to say. The same coded reassurance. The knowledge passed from one clerk to another, one generation of protectors to the next. Montague went upstairs. The room was small, a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked out onto the alley behind the hotel. The wallpaper was faded, the floorboards creaked, and there was a faint smell of mildew that no amount of airing out would ever quite remove. But the door had a lock that worked if you lifted the handle, and that was enough. David arrived 10 minutes later, knocked twice. Montague let him in. David stood just inside the door, looking around the room and said, "This is it?" Montague said, "This is it." David started laughing. Not cruel laughter. Just the kind of laughter that comes when reality is so far from what you imagined that all you can do is laugh. He said, "I have spent 3 months building this up in my head. I pictured something romantic, candles, nice sheets, maybe a view." Montague said, "We have a view of an alley." David crossed the room and looked out the window. Garbage bins, wet cobblestones, a cat picking through refuse. He turned back to Montague and said, "It is perfect." They spent that night in room 7 of the Colonnade Hotel, and it was nothing like the romantic fantasy either of them had imagined. The bed was too small. The mattress was lumpy. They could hear the couple arguing in the next room and someone coughing 2 floors down. The rain hammered against the window and the room got progressively colder as the night went on. But they were together, for a full night, without fear, or at least with less fear than usual, with a door that locked and a clerk downstairs who would not ask questions. In the morning, they left separately, following the script. Montague first, returning the key to Peter, who took it without comment. David, 10 minutes later, slipping out while Peter was occupied with another guest. They met 3 streets away and walked to a coffee house for breakfast, sat across from each other at a small table by the window, eating toast and drinking bad coffee, and Montague thought that this was possibly the happiest he had ever been. It was such a small thing. Breakfast with someone after spending the night together, something that most people took for granted, something that for them required planning and risk, and knowledge of which hotels had clerks who would look away. They went back to the Colonnade 6 more times over the next year. Room 7 became their room. Peter the clerk became someone they trusted. The shabby hotel with the smell of mildew became a place that meant something to them. And they were not unique. All over London, men were doing the same thing, finding the few remaining safe spaces and holding on to them, building relationships in the margins, in the rented rooms, and the boarding houses, and the weekend trips to Brighton. The network adapted. It always had. When hotels became too dangerous, men found other options. When public spaces were patrolled, they found private ones. When the law made one thing impossible, they found another way. But adaptation was exhausting. It required constant vigilance, constant calculation of risk, constant awareness that any moment of carelessness could lead to arrest or exposure or ruin. And some men could not sustain it. Some men gave up. Married women they did not love, accepted loneliness as permanent, convinced themselves that desire could be suppressed if you just tried hard enough. There was a man named Henry who used to come to the Saturday gatherings at Fitzroy Square. Montague met him in the spring of 1901. Henry was 35, a bank clerk, quietly desperate in the way that people are desperate when they have spent years denying themselves something fundamental. Henry had tried for years to live the way society expected. He had courted women. He had proposed marriage twice and been accepted once. He had made it as far as setting a wedding date before he could not go through with it. He had called off the engagement a week before the ceremony and spent the next 6 months being interrogated by his family about what had gone wrong. He came to London because he could not stand Birmingham anymore, could not stand the questions, the judgment, the constant pressure to explain himself. In London, at least, you could be anonymous. He came to the gathering in Fitzroy Square because someone at a pub had mentioned it in passing, a coded reference that Henry barely understood but followed anyway. He sat in the corner for 3 hours, watching, not speaking to anyone, looking like he might run for the door at any moment. Montague noticed him, went over, introduced himself, asked if this was Henry's first time. Henry nodded. Montague said, "It is overwhelming, I know, but it gets easier." Henry said, "Does it?" And Montague did not know how to answer that, because yes, some things got easier. You learned the codes. You learned how to find safe spaces. You learned that you were not alone. But other things never got easier. The fear never went away entirely. The awareness that you were breaking the law just by existing the way you existed. The knowledge that any moment of visibility could destroy everything you had built. Henry came back to 2 more gatherings. Then he stopped. Montague did not see him again for months. When they finally ran into each other by chance on a street in Holborn, Henry looked different, thinner, more closed off. Montague asked if he was all right. Henry said he was fine, said he had decided it was too much. The risk, the secrecy, the constant lying. He said he was going back to Birmingham, going to try again to live normally, maybe marry, maybe have children, do what was expected. Montague wanted to argue, wanted to say that normal was not worth the cost, that living a lie would destroy him more slowly but just as thoroughly as arrest would. But he could also see that Henry had already made his decision, that some part of him had broken under the weight of trying to be something he was not, and now he was trying to break a different part instead. They said goodbye on that street corner. Montague never saw him again, never learned whether Henry made it back to Birmingham, or whether he found some kind of peace in the life he chose. Henry became another name that appeared briefly in the historical record and then vanished. That was common. Men came to the network, stayed for a while, and then left. Some because they were arrested, some because they moved away, some because they could not sustain the double life anymore and chose to bury the part of themselves that did not fit, and some because they found what they needed and built stable lives and no longer required the network's protection. Montague and David were among the lucky ones. They stayed together for 5 years. David eventually left his teaching position in Surrey and moved to London permanently. He and Montague rented a flat together in Bloomsbury, a modest 2-room apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that housed mostly artists and writers who minded their own business. They lived as roommates, officially. Friends sharing expenses. No one questioned it, or if anyone suspected otherwise, they kept it to themselves. They still went to the Saturday gatherings at Fitzroy Square occasionally, though less frequently as they got older. They still knew about the colonnade, though they rarely needed it anymore now that they had their own space. But they remembered. They remembered the shabby hotel room with the smell of mildew. They remembered Peter the clerk, who never asked questions. They remembered the script, the codes, the careful navigation of a system designed to keep them apart. And when younger men came to the gatherings, looking lost and desperate, the way Montague had been at 19, they made sure to pass on the information. Which places were safe, which clerks understood, how to read a lobby, how to follow the script. The map kept being redrawn. Hotels closed or became unsafe. New ones opened or were discovered. Clerks retired or were replaced. The network was never stable, never guaranteed. It required constant maintenance, constant sharing of information, constant small acts of protection. But it survived. Through the worst years of persecution, through the trials and the arrests, and the moral panic, the network survived. Because men needed it. Because the alternative was isolation and loneliness and slow death of the spirit. And because there were always people willing to take the risk. Clerks like Thomas Webb and Arthur Bingham and Peter. Landladies like Martha in Whitechapel and Agnes in Soho. Shop owners who passed along information. Men who had been through it themselves and refused to let others go through it alone. By 1905, the landscape had shifted again. King Edward VII was on the throne. The Victorian era was officially over, though Victorian morality persisted. The laws had not changed. The persecution continued. But there was a sense, faint but present, that things might eventually improve. New organisations were forming. The British Society for the Study of Sex Psychology, which would not be founded until 1914, but which already had predecessors in study groups and private discussions. Men like Edward Carpenter and Lawrence Houseman and Havelock Ellis were writing more openly, arguing that homosexuality was not a disease or a crime, but a natural variation of human sexuality. Their arguments did not change the law, but they changed the conversation. They made it possible to imagine a future where men would not have to sneak into shabby hotels and trust their lives to tired desk clerks. That future was still decades away, further than anyone in 1905 could have imagined. It would take 2 world wars and the slow collapse of Victorian morality and generations of activism before the laws began to change. But the seeds were being planted. in the gatherings at Fitzroy Square, in the letters between Edward Carpenter and his correspondents across England, in the networks of information and protection that men built for each other, and in the hotel rooms. The shabby, imperfect, sometimes dangerous hotel rooms where men learned that they were not alone, where they spent nights that should have been ordinary but were precious because they were so rare, where they discovered that desire could be met with something other than shame. Those rooms mattered. They saved lives, not dramatically, but by making life bearable, by providing moments of connection in a world designed to keep people apart, by proving that intimacy was possible even when it was illegal. The rooms themselves are gone now. The colonnade was torn down in 1912. The old plough was converted into offices in 1920. Most of the boarding houses and cheap hotels that served this function have been demolished or renovated beyond recognition. But the memory survives, in journals and letters, in coded references and oblique mentions, in the private papers of men who lived through those years and wrote about them carefully, knowing that what they were documenting was important, even if it could not be published in their lifetimes. We know about Thomas Webb because Edward Carpenter mentioned him in 3 separate journal entries. We know about Arthur Bingham because Lawrence Houseman described him in his papers. We know about the colonnade because it appears in letters and memoirs from a dozen different men. We know the names of the hotels, the clerks, the landladies, the street addresses. We know the prices they charged and the scripts they followed and the small coded reassurances they offered. We know because someone decided to write it down. Because Edward and Lawrence and John Addington Symonds and dozens of others believed that future generations would want to know. That this history mattered even though it was happening in shadows and margins. They were right. It did matter. It does matter. Because for every young person who discovers they are different, who believes they are alone, who cannot imagine a future where they can be themselves, there is enormous power in learning that others came before. That people have always found ways to survive. That networks have always existed, invisible but real, built by people who decided to help each other even when helping was dangerous. The question the title asks is simple. How did gay couples find hotels in Victorian London? The answer, you now understand, is complicated. They found them through networks built on whispers and trust. They found them through trial and error, through failed attempts and humiliating rejections, and nights spent apart because nowhere would take them. They found them through the kindness of desk clerks who chose discretion over enforcement. They found them in neighbourhoods that were declining, in establishments that could not afford to be choosy, in coastal towns far from the surveillance of the city. But the deeper answer is that they found them because they had to, because the need for connection, for intimacy, for the simple human comfort of sleeping beside someone you love is stronger than law, stronger than fear, stronger than the very real risk of arrest and imprisonment and social death. Men like Edward Carpenter and George Merrill found ways to be together that did not require hotels at all. They built a life in Millthorpe that lasted 4 decades, a quiet domestic existence that should not have been radical but was. They proved that it was possible to survive, to build something lasting, even in a society determined to make that impossible. But not everyone had Edward's resources or his courage. Most men had to navigate the system that existed, not the one they wished for. And that system required knowledge, maps written in memory, information passed carefully from person to person, the names of hotels and clerks and landladies who might help. The infrastructure was fragile. Hotels that were safe one year became dangerous the next. Clerks who understood retired or were replaced. The whole network could collapse if too many people talked too openly, if the police decided to crack down, if public attention turned towards something everyone had agreed to ignore. But it never collapsed entirely. It bent, it shifted, it moved underground when it had to. But it survived. Because at its core, it was not really about hotels or clerks or coded information. It was about the fundamental human refusal to be isolated. The decision, made over and over by thousands of individual men, that they would find each other no matter what obstacles were placed in their way. Think about what that required. The courage to walk into a hotel lobby not knowing if you would be allowed to stay or arrested on the spot. The vulnerability of trusting a stranger with information that could destroy you. The resilience to keep trying after being turned away, humiliated, made to feel that your desire for connection was shameful and criminal. And think about the people who helped. Thomas Webb, working the night desk at the Old Plough, slipping men the information they needed to stay safe. Martha in Whitechapel, letting rooms to men who had nowhere else to go. Peter at the Colonnade, learning the same quiet codes from Arthur Bingham, who learned them from someone before him. These were not activists, not heroes in any conventional sense, just people doing their jobs with a little more humanity than the law required. They saved lives, not dramatically, not in ways that made the history books, but in the accumulated small kindnesses that made survival possible. The extra information about which rooms had working locks. The decision not to call the police when it would have been easy to call them. The willingness to see what was happening and choose not to punish it. There is a tendency, when we look back at history, to focus on the famous cases. Oscar Wilde, the Cleveland Street scandal, the trials that made newspapers. And those cases matter. They show us the machinery of persecution, the brutality of a legal system designed to destroy anyone who stepped outside narrow definitions of acceptable behavior. But between the famous cases were thousands of ordinary moments. Men finding each other, spending nights together, building relationships that lasted years or decades, creating small spaces of joy and intimacy inside a system that wanted them to be miserable and alone. Those moments do not make history books. They happen in rented rooms and boarding houses and weekend trips to Brighton. They happen in conversations at gatherings in Fitzroy Square, in letters written in code, in the accumulated knowledge of which streets to walk down and which to avoid. And they matter just as much as the trials. More, maybe, because persecution is only half the story. The other half is survival. The networks and strategies and small rebellions that allowed people to survive. The refusal to accept isolation, even when isolation was the law. By the time the Victorian era ended officially in 1901, the infrastructure of gay survival in London had been rebuilt and redrawn dozens of times. It would continue to shift through the Edwardian period, through 2 world wars, through decades more of persecution, before the laws finally began to change. Partial decriminalization did not come until 1967. 1967. That is how long the system persisted. 82 years after the Labouchere Amendment made gross indecency a crime. Generations of men lived and died under those laws, navigating the same scripts, taking the same risks, building the same fragile networks. And even after 1967, even after partial decriminalization, hotels were still dangerous. Because decriminalization was not the same as acceptance. Because social stigma persisted long after the law changed. Because desk clerks still had the power to refuse service, to make life difficult, to humiliate people for wanting what everyone else took for granted. It took decades more for that to change. For hotels to become truly safe spaces. For the question of whether 2 men could rent a room together to become so ordinary that no one thought twice about it. We are still living in the world that those Victorian networks built. The infrastructure looks different now. The organizations are above ground. The information is shared openly instead of in whispers. But the basic principle is the same. People protecting each other. People sharing knowledge that makes survival possible. People refusing to let anyone face the world alone. When you walk into a hotel anywhere in Britain today with someone you love, regardless of gender, and the desk clerk hands you a key without a second thought, you are benefiting from more than a century of people who fought for that moment to be ordinary. You are benefiting from Thomas Webb, who worked a night desk and chose kindness over enforcement. From Martha in Whitechapel, who kept a pot of tea on the stove for men who needed somewhere to rest. From Edward Carpenter, who documented everything so that future generations would know this history existed. From Montague and David and the thousands of men whose names we do not know, who kept trying even when it would have been easier to give up. They did not live to see the world we have now. Most of them died before the laws changed. They spent their entire lives in a system that told them they were criminals and perverts and threats to society. They had every reason to despair, to believe that nothing would ever get better. But they built networks anyway. They protected each other anyway. They found joy in rented rooms with peeling wallpaper and the smell of mildew anyway. They refused to accept that isolation was inevitable. They insisted, quietly but absolutely, that they deserved connection and intimacy and love. And they were right. The rooms themselves are gone. The old plough and the colonnade and Martha's boarding house on Bedford Street, demolished or renovated, turned into offices and luxury apartments and chain coffee shops. The physical spaces do not exist anymore, but what happened in those rooms survives, in the letters and journals that were carefully preserved, in the coded references that historians have learned to decode, in the private papers that were sealed for decades and are now being opened and studied and added to the historical record. We know more about Victorian gay life now than we ever have. More archives are being digitized. More journals are being unsealed. More historians are doing the work of piecing together what happened in the margins and shadows. And what they are finding is not just a story of persecution. It is also a story of resilience, of people who built elaborate systems of mutual protection, who created culture and community under conditions that were designed to make both impossible, who loved each other despite everything. That is the inheritance. Not just the persecution, though that matters and must be remembered, but also the refusal to be broken by it. The stubborn insistence that life could contain moments of beauty and connection, even when those moments were illegal. Edward Carpenter died in 1929 at the age of 84 in the house in Millthorpe that he had shared with George Merrill for nearly 40 years. George had died the year before. Edward wrote in his final journal entry that the house felt empty without him, that he was ready to go, that he had lived longer than he expected and seen more change than he thought possible. But he also wrote that the world was still not safe, that the laws had not changed enough, that young people were still suffering under the same persecution he had fought against his entire adult life. He wrote that he hoped the work would continue after he was gone, that someone would keep documenting, keep fighting, keep building networks. He was right to hope. The work did continue. It is still continuing. Every Pride parade, every LGBTQ organization, every moment of visibility and activism is part of the same project that Edward and Thomas Webb and Martha and thousands of others were working on in the 1890s, making the world safer, building networks, refusing isolation. But it is also worth remembering that the grand political victories, the legal changes and the social progress all rest on a foundation of small personal acts. The desk clerk who hands over a room key, the friend who shares information about safe spaces, the person who sees someone struggling and decides to help. Those acts still matter. They mattered in 1885 and they matter now, because systems change slowly, but individual kindness is immediate. Because while we wait for laws to catch up with justice, people still need places to sleep and hands to hold, and the knowledge that they are not facing the world alone. If you are queer, if you have ever had to calculate whether a space was safe before entering it, if you have ever hidden part of yourself to avoid judgment or violence, you are part of this lineage. The Victorian men who memorized which hotels would take them are your ancestors. The networks they built are the foundation you stand on. And if you are not queer, if you have never had to navigate this particular kind of fear, then understand this. The desk clerk at the old plough was not gay. He was just a man who decided that his job was to rent rooms, not to enforce morality. Martha in Whitechapel was not gay. She was just a woman who believed privacy was a human right. They were part of the network too. The work of making the world safer is not something that only the oppressed can do. It is something everyone can do, by choosing kindness over enforcement, by protecting information that needs protecting, by deciding that the struggle of people who are different from you is still your concern. That is what Thomas Webb did every night at the Old Plough, when he turned the registry book toward two men and did not ask questions. That is what Peter did at the colonnade when he mentioned which rooms had working locks, small acts. But in a system designed to isolate and punish, small acts of protection became revolutionary. You and I are sitting in a room they could not have imagined. A room where this conversation is legal, where the information about which hotels were safe can be spoken openly instead of whispered in code, where the names of men who loved each other can be said without fear of arrest. We are sitting in the future that Edward Carpenter hoped for but did not believe he would live to see. The future that Montague and David were trying to build when they rented room 7 at the colonnade. The future that Thomas Webb was protecting every time he looked away from something he was not supposed to see. They did not get to live here. But we do. And the least we can do, the absolute least, is remember them. Remember what they survived. Remember what they built. Remember that the ordinary freedoms we take for granted were fought for, one hotel room at a time, by people who refused to accept that isolation was inevitable. Tonight, when you go to sleep in whatever room you are in whatever part of the world you are listening from, think about the men who slept in room 9 at the Old Plough in 1885. Think about Edward and Albert, Edward and George, Montague and David, and the thousands whose names we do not know. They were terrified. They were breaking the law. They were risking everything for a single night together, and they decided it was worth it. They decided that connection mattered more than safety, that love was worth the risk. They were right. This is the inheritance. Not just the persecution, but the survival. Not just the fear, but the stubborn insistence on joy despite the fear. Not just the isolation, but the networks built to resist it. You are part of that lineage, whether you know it or not. Every time you choose kindness over enforcement, every time you protect someone who is vulnerable, every time you refuse to let someone be alone in their struggle, you are continuing the work that Thomas Webb did at the Old Plough. You are building the same network, just in a different time. The work is not finished. There are still places in the world where asking which hotels are safe is a question of survival. There are still people being arrested for loving the wrong person. There are still kids growing up believing they are alone, that no one like them has ever existed, that their desire for connection is shameful and impossible. Tell them the truth. Tell them about Edward and George, who built a life that lasted 4 decades. Tell them about the networks that survived a century of persecution. Tell them about the desk clerks and landladies who chose to help instead of harm. Tell them that people have always found ways to survive, and that they will too. And when you tell them, make sure they know this. The most radical thing you can do in a system designed to isolate you is refuse to be isolated. Find each other, protect each other, build networks, share information, create spaces where people can rest without fear. That is what the Victorian men did in their rented hotel rooms. That is what every generation has done since. That is what we are still doing now. May your dreams tonight be free of the fear that they carried. May you sleep in a room with a door that locks and a bed you do not have to hide in. May you wake beside someone you love without having to pretend you are strangers. And may you remember, always, that the room you are sleeping in tonight was built on a foundation of small acts of courage by people whose names you will never know. They did not do it for recognition. They did it because the alternative was unthinkable. Because isolation is death and connection is life. And they chose life even when choosing life was illegal. They kept each other company in the darkness. Tonight, we keep them company too. That is all sleep needs to be. A quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. Good night, and sleep well.